In the grand theatres of the Gilded Age, where industrial millionaires performed respectability and European nobles auctioned their bloodlines to American fortunes, the greatest actress never took a legitimate stage. Elizabeth Bigley understood that America's richest men craved something their steel mills and railroad empires could never manufacture: acceptance into the sacred circles of inherited wealth. She studied their weaknesses like a master playwright, crafting her audience, recognizing that beneath their bluster about self-made success lay an aching vulnerability to anyone who might possess what they desperately lacked: true aristocratic connections. Her stage would become the marble halls of America's most prestigious banks, her costume trunk filled with forged Carnegie securities, her script a melodrama of illegitimate inheritance that would have been rejected by the cheapest vaudeville house. For 7 years she performed the role of secret heiress so convincingly that bank presidents fought to loan her money, each believing he alone had discovered the Carnegie family's hidden treasure. Thus, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we explore how a woman with a 4th-grade education orchestrated the most audacious theatrical production in financial history. Elizabeth Bigley emerged from the muddy farmlands of Eastwood, Ontario, in 1857, the third daughter of railway labourer Daniel Bigley and his wife Mary Ann, born into poverty so grinding it might have crushed a less imaginative spirit. At 14, young Betty orchestrated her first swindle with the audacity of a seasoned grifter, forging a letter from a fictional English uncle claiming she'd inherited a fortune. She marched into a Woodstock bank, opened an account with this fabricated inheritance letter, then proceeded to write worthless cheques all over town for goods she had no intention of paying for. When arrested for forgery, she played the insanity card so convincingly that authorities released her, establishing a pattern of theatrical manipulation that would serve her for decades. The quiet, daydreaming child her family remembered had transformed into a criminal prodigy, telling outlandish stories that hinted at her future as one of America's most audacious con artists. By 1875, at age 18, she'd abandoned Canada for Cleveland, Ohio, joining her sister Alice York and reinventing herself as Lydia Scott, then Madame Lydia de Vere, operating fortune-telling parlours and passing bad cheques across Ohio, Illinois and beyond. Her aliases multiplied like her crimes: Elizabeth Cunard, Emily Heathcliff, Marie LaRose, each identity crafted for specific marks and abandoned when the law drew too close. Her first marriage in 1882 to Dr. Wallace S. Springsteen lasted exactly 12 days before her criminal past surfaced, sending the good doctor fleeing for divorce court in 1883. She cycled through husbands like aliases. John R. Scott divorced her after she confessed adultery, while C.L. Hoover had the good grace to die in 1888, leaving her $50,000 and a son named Emile, born in 1886 or 87. Between marriages, she ran a brothel under the name Cassie Hoover, though when confronted about this enterprise, she faked a dramatic fainting spell and claimed she thought it was merely a boarding house for young ladies. Her criminal career hit a temporary snag in 1889 when Toledo authorities convicted her of forgery, sentencing her to 9.5 years in the state penitentiary. But Betty Bigley had friends in high places. Ohio Governor William McKinley, the future president, paroled her after just 4 years in 1893, though his reasons for this clemency remain mysteriously undocumented. She returned to Cleveland as Cassie Hoover, prowling the salons and parlours of Euclid Avenue, known as Millionaire's Row, where America's industrial titans built monuments to their newfound wealth. The reformed forger studied these men carefully, their vanities, their greed, their desperate hunger for social connections that might elevate them from mere money to true aristocracy. She absorbed their mannerisms, their vocabularies, their pretensions, filing away every detail for the performance of a lifetime while continuing to operate her dubious boarding house enterprise. In 1897 she met Dr. Leroy S. Chadwick, a respected Cleveland physician who reportedly fell in love after she eased his rheumatism with an impromptu back massage during their first meeting at her establishment. The good doctor, blissfully unaware of her criminal history, her previous marriages, or her current brothel operations, married her that same year, transforming Elizabeth Bigley into Mrs. Cassie L. Chadwick of Euclid Avenue. Now positioned among Cleveland's elite, with a respectable husband and a fashionable address, she possessed everything necessary for her greatest swindle, except one crucial element. A story so audacious that no banker would dare question it. That story would involve the richest man in America, a Scottish immigrant named Andrew Carnegie, whose steel empire generated wealth beyond ordinary comprehension and whose name alone could open any vault in the nation. The scheme that would make Cassie Chadwick infamous began with a carefully orchestrated piece of theatre outside Andrew Carnegie's Manhattan mansion at 2 East 91st Street in 1897. She hired James Dillon, an Ohio lawyer, to accompany her to New York on urgent business, then directed their carriage to stop outside Carnegie's imposing residence. While Dillon waited in the coach, Cassie swept up the front steps, slipped through a tradesman's entrance she'd scouted earlier, waited 30 minutes in the vestibule, counting seconds like a stage performer, then emerged waving cheerfully at an imaginary figure in an upstairs window. Returning to the carriage with calculated breathlessness, she confided to Dillon that Andrew Carnegie was her father, her illegitimate father, a secret that must never be revealed to protect both their reputations. To support this fiction, she produced forged promissory notes, supposedly signed by Carnegie, including one for $250,000 that misspelled guarantee as guarantee, a detail that would later amuse Carnegie himself in court. She claimed to possess $5 million in securities from her father, with promises of $400 million upon his death, roughly $14 billion in today's money, making her potentially the wealthiest woman in America. Back in Cleveland, she leveraged Dillon's eyewitness testimony, letting him spread the gossip through banking circles, while she played the reluctant heiress, desperate to keep her shameful parentage secret, yet forced by circumstances to seek loans. Her genius lay in exploiting Victorian propriety. Before showing any documents, she made bankers sign pledges swearing never to reveal her parentage, turning their own social codes into chains that bound them to secrecy. She targeted specific institutions with surgical precision: the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, Wade Park Banking Company, Lincoln National Bank, each selected for their combination of available capital and gullible leadership. The first to bite was the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, whose officers loaned her $800,000, based solely on her forged securities and their dreams of managing the Carnegie fortune. Charles T. Beckwith, the bank's president, became her most enthusiastic champion, personally guaranteeing an additional $102,000 while dreaming of transforming his institution into the Carnegie Bank of the West. She operated a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using new loans to pay interest on old ones, creating an illusion of wealth through carefully timed circular payments between institutions. Her forgeries were embarrassingly amateur. Beyond the spelling errors, the signatures looked nothing like Carnegie's actual hand, but bankers were too blinded by greed to notice obvious flaws. Several grey-bearded bank directors later admitted under oath that they'd abandoned all standard procedures simply because she was a lady of evident breeding with a supposed Carnegie connection. She demanded absolute secrecy from each lender, playing them against each other, suggesting that Carnegie would be mortified if multiple banks knew of her existence. That discretion was paramount to maintaining their relationship. No one dared contact Carnegie directly. What if the richest man in America took offence at questions about an illegitimate daughter? What if he moved his millions elsewhere in retaliation? Between 1897 and 1904, she extracted over $2 million from America's banking elite, all desperate to court the secret Carnegie heiress who'd mysteriously appeared in their midst. The scheme accelerated as her reputation grew, with banks actively seeking her business, competing to offer better terms to the woman they believed would inherit the largest fortune in American history. But in Boston, Herbert B. Newton, who'd loaned her $190,800, was growing tired of excuses and promises. his patience exhausted as repayment deadlines passed without satisfaction. At the height of her fraudulent empire, Cassie Chadwick transformed borrowed millions into a spectacle of consumption that would have impressed actual royalty, earning her the title Queen of Ohio from breathless society reporters. She crammed 30 closets in her Euclid Avenue mansion with Parisian gowns, each worth more than a working man's annual salary, creating a textile museum of criminal proceeds that required its own inventory system. The gold organ she installed in her music room cost $35,000, over $1 million in today's money, a gleaming monument to her theatrical nature, though she never learned to play a single note, using it purely as decoration. Her 1903 jewellery receipts alone totaled $200,000, including a diamond tiara from Tiffany's, a sapphire dog collar she claimed commemorated her deceased mother, and enough precious stones to stock a small jewellery store. She maintained a private railway car for shopping expeditions to New York, where she'd reserve entire floors of the Waldorf Astoria, throwing champagne parties for strangers who amused her and distributing $100 bills as party favours. One Lucerne jeweller testified she'd purchased $5,000 in watches during a single afternoon spree, distributing them to hotel staff, cab drivers, and random pedestrians, like a demented fairy godmother. Her household employed 14 servants, including a French chef who quit after she demanded he prepare a banquet for 60 guests with 2 hours' notice. The guests never materialised, leaving mountains of uneaten delicacies. Society reporters chronicled her every appearance: violet silk gowns with ermine capes worth thousands, black chantilly lace over white satin, hats featuring ostrich plumes worth $800 that required special boxes for storage. She claimed to support numerous charities and the suffrage movement, hosting elaborate fundraising teas, though investigators later found no record of significant donations. The money apparently evaporated into silk, sapphires, and theatrical gestures. Local Cleveland legend held that she once tipped a Carnegie Hall usher $1,000 after he complimented her diamonds, though she'd never actually met her supposed father at any of his cultural endowments. Her dinner parties became legendary productions where she'd mysteriously excuse herself to take urgent telegrams from father, returning with increasingly elaborate tales of steel mergers, Scottish castles, and secret trust funds. Dr. Chadwick lived in mounting bewilderment as luxury goods and creditor notices arrived in equal measure, his wife explaining everything away as temporary Carnegie family complications that would soon resolve themselves. The Cleveland Smart Set whispered about her eccentricities, the imported Swiss masseuses who arrived weekly, the trunk loads of unworn ball gowns, the peculiar habit of buying identical items by the dozen, claiming different Carnegie relatives required matching gifts. When questioned about her extravagance, she'd smile mysteriously and mention her $400 million inheritance, adding convincing details about Carnegie's specific instructions for managing the fortune until his death. Her spending accelerated through 1904 as if she sensed the approaching end, ordering custom furniture from Paris, commissioning portraits from fashionable artists, and purchasing entire collections of rare books she'd never read. But by November, Herbert Newton's Boston lawsuit had shattered the illusion, triggering a cascade of nervous creditors who suddenly questioned why the Carnegie heiress needed so many loans from so many banks. On November 23rd, newspapers reported indictment rumours while Citizens National Bank of Oberlin suspended operations, its depositors forming panicked lines that stretched around the block, desperate to salvage their savings. She withdrew her last $100,000 from Lincoln National Bank and fled Cleveland for New York, cramming the cash into a specially made money belt, leaving behind a mansion stuffed with treasures. The woman who'd lived like visiting royalty was now a fugitive, holed up in the Hotel Breslin while her kingdom of forged notes and borrowed luxury crumbled under federal investigation. Federal marshals arrested Cassie Chadwick at the Hotel Breslin on December 7, 1904, finding over $100,000 in the money belt strapped beneath her corset. Cash she'd desperately withdrawn in her final free hours. Boston papers gleefully reported that Newton's lawyers had to pry a diamond-studded lorgnette from her purse before marshals would apply the handcuffs, adding a touch of jewellery-based comedy to the dramatic arrest scene. Her husband, Dr. Leroy Chadwick, filed for divorce the moment her arrest hit the newspapers and fled to Europe with his daughter, abandoning the woman whose back rubs had once charmed him into matrimony. The March 1905 trial in Cleveland became the social event of the season, with society matrons fighting for gallery seats, arriving hours early to watch the Duchess of Diamonds face justice for her unprecedented fraud. Andrew Carnegie himself attended the proceedings, studying the forged notes with evident amusement, and telling reporters their orthography alone would have hanged them, chuckling at the misspelled guarantee that had fooled so many bankers. Prosecutors wheeled in 18 steamer trunks, overflowing with gowns, jewels and luxury goods as evidence, the display drawing such massive crowds that police installed rope lines inside the federal courtroom to manage spectators. Bank presidents took the stand one after another, several grey-bearded financial titans actually fainting under cross-examination when forced to publicly admit they'd loaned hundreds of thousands based on obvious forgeries and whispered rumours. Charles Beckwith of Oberlin testified how she'd promised to make his bank the Carnegie Bank of the West, his voice breaking as he described his complete financial ruin and the destruction of the institution his family had built. The parade of duped bankers continued for days, each admitting they'd never verified the signatures, never contacted Carnegie, never questioned why an heiress worth $400 million needed their money so desperately. The jury needed less than 2 hours to convict her on 7 counts of conspiracy against the government and conspiracy to wreck the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, a federally chartered institution. Judge Taylor sentenced her to 14 years in prison and a $70,000 fine, noting that her crimes had destroyed not just banks, but entire families' life savings, leaving widows and orphans destitute. When she arrived at Ohio State Penitentiary in January 1906, she attempted to bring Persian rugs, lace curtains, a gold mantel clock, photographs, and furniture into her cell, as if prison were merely another residence to decorate. Exasperated wardens allowed only a velvet rocking chair and extra pillows for medical reasons, though she quickly established a prison economy, paying fellow inmates in candy and canteen money to provide daily Swiss-style massages. Her health deteriorated rapidly. By September 1907, she'd suffered a nervous collapse and gone blind, spending her final days in the prison infirmary, requesting hot cocoa and specific hymns from the prison band. On October 10, 1907, her 50th birthday, she made a final request for the band to play "Nearer, My God, to Thee" before dying of heart disease that afternoon, ending her journey from Canadian farm to American prison. Her estate auction netted less than $1,000 against debts exceeding $2 million, leaving creditors with nothing but memories of forged Carnegie notes, wild spending sprees, and their own catastrophic gullibility. The Citizens National Bank of Oberlin never reopened, its president Charles Beckwith dying bankrupt and broken, while other institutions instituted third-party collateral verification systems and confidential character sheets that evolved into modern credit bureaus. Cleveland renamed East Prospect Street to Carnegie Avenue in 1906, partly to cleanse the city's reputation after the affair that had transformed it from industrial powerhouse to national laughingstock. The Canadian farm girl who'd forged her first check at 14 had managed to expose the entire American banking system's vulnerability to greed, vanity, and a woman with terrible spelling but magnificent nerve. And now we'd like to see you in the comments. Were you familiar with Cassie's Carnegie inheritance scam? We look forward to hearing your personal thoughts below. And with that said, thank you for joining us for another episode of Old Money Allure.